In the last lecture, we saw that numbers, strings, and booleans are passed by value when they are passed as input arguments into a function. Meaning, within a function, any change to the number, string, or boolean is not reflected in the calling code. Objects and arrays in JavaScript, on the other hand, are passed by reference to functions. What does pass by reference mean? This means that when arrays and objects are passed as input arguments to functions, the function operates on the original array or object. Objects and arrays, unlike numbers or strings, are passed as is to functions. No copy is made within a function, like we spoke about earlier. Objects and arrays are passed as is. So functions, when they work on an object or an array, are working with the original. They are not working on a copy. Any changes that they make to the object are made to the original object. This means that if the function modifies the variable, the original is indeed changed. So if you have an object and a property of that object is modified within a function, the original object property outside the function in the calling code will indeed be changed. The same holds true for arrays. So remember, numbers, strings, and booleans are passed by value. Changes in a function do not affect the calling code. Objects and arrays are passed by reference. Any changes made within the function are reflected in the calling code. There are more subtleties in the pass by reference, and we'll learn them as we look at an example. We've just said that when an object or an array, a variable which holds an object or an array, is passed into a function, it's passed as is. If the function modifies a property of the object or adds or removes elements from the array, it's reflected in the calling code. The original is indeed changed. But there is a subtle point here. There is a big but. Pay close attention because this can be confusing. If the function reassigns the variable, the original is not changed. So let's say that the variable name is A within the function. If A is an object and you modify a property of A, then this change is reflected in the calling code. If A is an object and you reassign A to a new object, that is not reflected in the calling code. Are you confused? Don't worry, we'll see this using examples. It'll become much clearer then. What we're going to do is to look at two bits of code. One which will modify an object and an array, and the other which will reassign an object and array. And you'll see exactly how they behave. The first bit of code is called modify x. It takes in an object rectangle and an array weekdays, and it tries to modify it. The second is a function reassign x. It takes in the same rectangle object and the same weekdays array and reassigns their values. We'll be looking at what modification and reassignment looks at in detail, but take a look at the code on screen and make yourself comfortable with what's happening in that code. We'll be digging a little bit deeper in just a second. So there it is, modify x works on a rectangle, that's an object, and weekdays, that's an array, and it modifies them. Reassign x, on the other hand, works on a rectangle object and the weekdays array. The same two variables, the same two objects and array. Reassign x reassigns them, and modify X modifies them. Here is the code in the body of modify X. It's updating a property of rectangle and adding something to weekdays. Here is the code in the body of reassign X. It's reassigning rectangle to a new object, a new rectangle, and reassigning weekdays to a new array. Let's see what happens when we run this code. Starting first with the code in modify X. Within modify X, the meat of the code basically takes the rectangle object that's been passed in and updates its length property to be multiplied by 2. So rectangle.length is equal to rectangle.length multiplied by 2. This is a modification of the object that's passed in, the rectangle object that's passed in. In addition to the array, we add one more day called Manic Mondays. So the weekdays array that's passed in gets another element using weekdays.push Manic Mondays. When the object and the array passed in is modified in such a manner, the original is indeed changed. The calling code which passed in the rectangle and the weekdays array, the rectangle object and the weekdays array, will find outside this function that the length has changed and the weekdays array has an additional element called Manic Mondays. So if the function modifies the variable, the original object and array is indeed changed. Now let's look at the but. But if within the function we reassign the variable rather than modifying the original object or array, it's not reflected in the original. So what does reassignment mean? Take a look at the highlighted code on screen. The rectangle and the weekdays objects are passed into the reassign X function, and we say rectangle is equal to new rectangle. We are creating a completely new object and assigning it to the rectangle variable. Or we say weekdays is equal to in block brackets Saturday, Sunday. We are assigning a completely new array to the weekdays variable. This is reassignment. Reassignment is very different from modification. In modification, we change the original objects. Reassignment, we created completely new objects and arrays and assigned it to the same variables. In this case, the original is not changed. The rectangle variable in the calling code and the weekdays variable in the calling code retain their original values. The original is not changed. Hopefully, now reassignment and modification makes a little more sense to you. If it does not, do not fear. We'll look at this example in detail by using console.log statements to check the initial state and the final states of the objects after modification and after reassignment. Here is the complete code for modify X and reassign X. We already saw the meat of the code earlier. This expanded code version includes the console.log statements we put in before modifying the objects and after modifying the objects, before reassigning the objects and after reassigning the objects. And here is the code which calls modify X and reassign X. We set up two objects, rectangle, which holds a new rectangle, and weekdays, which holds an array of days from Sunday through Friday. We then have a whole bunch of console.log statements to print the status of these objects before calling modify X, after calling modify X, before calling reassign X, and after calling reassign X. Let's run this code and focus on the output of the 3 lines of code that you see highlighted on screen. The console.log statement for the initial values, the function called modify x, and then the console.log statement for the values after modification. And this is the output. Let's see what the output says step by step. Initially, we set up a rectangle and the weekdays array. The initial values in the calling function, that's the function which calls modify x, is 5 and Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. That is, the length of the rectangle is 5 and the value of the weekdays array is Sunday through Friday. On entering the modify x function, before we actually perform the modification, once again we log to the console the value of the rectangle's length and the weekdays array. They are the same, 5 and Sunday through Friday. Now, we modify the rectangle's length and add Manic Monday to the weekdays array. And if you notice the output, the rectangle length is now 10 and the weekdays array now contains Sunday through Friday and Manic Mondays at the very end of the array. The modification has modified the values of the rectangle's length and the weekdays array within the modify function. And finally, when we return from the modify x function, go back to the calling function and check the value of the rectangle length and the weekdays array, you'll find that the rectangle length has been updated to 10 even in the original object. And as for the array, Manic Mondays is still present at the end of the array even in the original array. The initial values that we started off with have been changed permanently, which means objects and arrays, when they are modified inside a function, that modification is reflected in the calling code. This experiment and this bit of code proves that. That was modification. Let's see how reassignment works. Let's turn our attention to the 3 lines of code which first prints out the initial values of the object and the array, the object length and the array, calls reassign x, which reassigns the rectangle and the weekdays variable, and then prints out the final values of the rectangle length and the array after reassign x has been called. And here is the output that's displayed to the console when we run these 3 lines of code. First, the initial value of the rectangle length and the array. Then, before reassigning within the reassign x function, but before reassigning the variables. Then, the value of the variables after reassignments. And then finally, the value of the original rectangle and weekdays object outside reassign x after reassign x has returned. The initial values in the calling function are exactly like before. The length of the rectangle is 5 and weekdays contains all days from Sunday through Friday. No surprises there. Inside the reassign x function, before we actually do the reassignment, we check the value of the rectangle length and the weekdays array once again and find that it's the same as the initial values, 5 and then Sunday through Friday. Now comes the interesting part. We reassign the rectangle object and the weekdays array to new values. And then we print out what values it has inside the reassign x function. And you'll see, after reassignment of the rectangle object and the weekdays array, the new values of rectangle and weekdays within the reassign x function has rectangle.length equal to 7. That's because the new rectangle has length 7 and weekdays is just equal to Saturday and Sunday. Those are the new reassigned values. Now let's see how the values outside in the calling code are affected. If you look at the very last line that's printed on the console, you'll see that the original values of rectangle, the length of the rectangle, and the weekdays array is not affected at all. It remains unchanged. the original values after reassign x is called remains the same as the initial values. You can do a comparison with the two highlighted lines on screen. The rectangle length continues to be 5 outside reassign x, and weekdays array continues to have Sunday through Friday as the elements. Reassignment does not modify the original objects.